Hi, folks. Welcome back to the webinar series. I'll just give a couple minutes for people to get into the system, and then we will get started with today's webinar.
Ezra, just a quick check, the slides are showing okay?
Okay, got a bunch of folks signed in, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. So I want to welcome everybody back who's been coming to the webinar series or watching the recordings online throughout the year. It's been really great for the division to launch this new webinar series. This is the first time that Division 34 has had a webinar series. And I'm really excited that we're here for our final webinar talk of 2020. And also just want to put in a plug that I'm really excited that we're going to be continuing webinars into 2021 under the leadership of our current division president, Daniel Benkendorf. So I hope folks will continue to log in and more info will be coming out about the first few talks in the 2021 series. As usual, we've got the Q&A, so folks should feel free to leave questions there throughout the talk, and we'll have time at the end for our speaker to respond. So I'm really excited to introduce Dr. Neil Lewis Jr., who's an assistant professor of communication and social behavior at Cornell University, where he also holds a joint appointment in the Weill Cornell Medical College Division of General Internal Medicine. His work broadly examines how people's social contexts and identities influence their motivation to pursue their goals and their success in goal pursuit efforts. And he's done this work in multiple domains, including education, health, and most relevant for us today, environmental sustainability. And I'm really glad that he was able to join us today. And I want to turn it over to Neil.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks to Ezra for inviting me to speak in this series. So when we talked about what I'd present today, we talked a bit about me sharing insights and tips in conducting interdisciplinary action-oriented research, which is sort of a lot to cover in 40 minutes, but I'll do my best and hopefully we can have some good discussion at the end. I think it might be helpful if I shared a bit about my background and how I got to studying environmental issues in the first place. That'll help you to understand why I do my research in the way that I do, and we'll end up giving you some perspectives for why I end up sharing some of the strategies that I do towards the end. Let's see. So when I came to college, so I did my undergrad here at Cornell as well. When I came here, my initial plan was to become a lawyer. That's a profession I spent much of my childhood thinking about and imagining for myself. So I came to Cornell thinking that I would study things that would lead me down the path to law school, and thus I could live out my childhood dreams. Well, one of the things that Cornell does is that we let undergrads who think they might want to become lawyers actually take a few classes in the law school so we can get a feel for what the law might be like. So I did that, took some classes in law school and learned some really interesting things. But the biggest lesson I learned was that I did not want to be a lawyer. The law was interesting and it was important, but it just didn't feel like it was for me, at least not at that time. As you'll see later, the law has come back around to influence some of the research that I do now. But back then, one of the things I learned was that I didn't want to be a lawyer. So if not law, then what? Well, I studied economics and psychology as my two majors. And I did my undergraduate research in sociology, and then spent my extracurricular time as one of the few non-engineers on a systems engineering project team where we were building race cars, but that part is not so relevant. I did those things because what I realized I was actually interested in was how different forces in life, the thoughts and feelings that we have, the incentives that we face, where we are situated in society, and the processes that we encounter. How do all of those things work together to influence how people behave? Um, these were different ways of learning about why people behave in the ways that they do, and I found those things fascinating. Um, what I learned from each discipline felt incomplete on its own, but when I put them together by sort of looking over notes about what I was learning in each one, I felt like I had a better understanding of why people behaved in the ways that they did. And that's what I found really fascinating. Um, but I was not only fascinated by human behavior, I also wanted to use that knowledge to do some good, and to tackle some of the big problems that we face in society. And those desires to continue studying people, and to do something useful for the world really shaped the research I ended up doing in graduate school and in my career since then. So one of my mentors in graduate school was Frank Yates, who's a judgment decision-making scholar who, unfortunately, we just lost a week and a half ago. But when I was trying to figure out what are specific things that I could study in my research career, Frank gave me the following advice, which is advice I continue to pass on to students now. He said, it's really simple to try and figure out what you should study. You should study the things that keep you up at night. Figure out the problems that really weigh on you, and you can devote your research career to studying those things. You can use that as a way to improve our knowledge and address social problems at the same time. Well, one of the things that was keeping me up back then and continues to keep me up now is the issue of climate change and other sustainability related issues. I know I'm preaching to the choir a bit with this audience, but when I see reports out of the IPCC and elsewhere, I do worry about what that means for what's going to happen to us in the future. And so these are things that worried me then, continue to worry me now, and sort of drive why I studied this topic. One thing that was interesting, though, was even though I find these issues worrisome, one of the things I found fascinating was that not only were there other people who were less worried, there were, and continue to be, a sizable share of the American public, at least, that doesn't believe in anthropogenic climate change. So this was one of the first things I ended up studying in this realm. I thought it was fascinating that even though there's great scientific consensus around climate change, there's a sizable share of Americans that don't believe in climate change, and that even among believers, climate change is often not a high priority issue. That it's not considered an urgent problem many times. People would rather wait and see what happens rather than taking action now. Perceive climate change as sort of this distant problem that's going to affect people far away and far into the future, but not people in their local communities or right now. And this isn't just about lack of education. So that's something, like this set of things is something I found really fascinating. And so seeing those findings, the first thing I and my colleagues did was take a psychological approach to try and understand what was going on. So I was in a social psychology PhD program at the time, and that really guided the way that I initially started thinking about these issues. So I wanted to understand how much variability there was in people's climate change beliefs, what factors were associated with those beliefs, and what are the consequences of those beliefs. So that's where I started my work in the climate change and sustainability related domain. One of the first things we did was actually run a longitudinal study of American adults to measure these climate change beliefs and other attitudes, behaviors over time to get a sense of what was going on. So this was a study I ran in graduate school with my colleague Mike Hall and Phoebe Ellsworth at the University of Michigan. So we ran this longitudinal study on MTurk, and believe me, I'm well aware that MTurk is not the most representative sample of Americans for studying these kinds of attitudes. But, again, we started this when Mike and I were first-year graduate students. As hard as it might be to imagine, funders weren't rushing to give large grants to graduate students to run a nationally representative sample in the longitudinal study. So we did the best we could with an MTRIC sample at that time. What we did was we surveyed our participants 7 times over the course of the year. We ran the study from summer 2014 to summer 2015, again, measuring people's beliefs, attitudes, behaviors, and the like. So the sample, just to give you a sense of who we studied in this work, it was geographically representative of the US. So one of the things we were interested in was how people's local environments might influence these attitudes. And so getting geographic representativeness was something that was of interest to us, and we achieved that goal. But again, this was an MTRIC sample, so it's important to know this is not a politically representative sample. We had 71% Democrats in the sample. It's a mostly white sample, fairly well educated and young. So the sort of typical MTRIC demographics. In terms of retention in this longitudinal study, that's one thing you always have to worry about with longitudinal research. We had fairly decent retention. So, we had 73% of people come back from time 1 to time 2, and then things sort of stabilized after that. So we saw the usual time 1 drop that's often observed in longitudinal research, and then the sample stabilized after that. Of the 600, about 413 people came back for the rest of the surveys, and about half of them completed every single 10 point. So what we ended up doing with this work was we gathered all this data, and then we used a latent class growth analysis to analyze the data, which allowed us to examine whether there are differences in people's climate change belief trajectories. In other words, were there different kinds of Americans when it came to climate change beliefs, and what were the consequences of those different trajectories? What we found was 3 clusters in our data. We ended up calling them the highly concerned, which was the largest group, the cautiously worried, and the skeptics. Those are the 3 labels we used. But this is sort of what their belief trajectories look like. The biggest group, they believed in climate change, and that sort of held constant over time. Slight dip in the winter months, but that's a really small dip. The cautiously worried, again, fairly high beliefs in climate change, little less convinced during the winter months, but summer months really reinforce those beliefs in climate change. And then the skeptics started off sort of unsure and decreased in their beliefs over time. So that's one of the first things we did in that line. But we weren't just interested in beliefs. We were also interested in behaviors as well as policy support and other things. And so we asked people about their behaviors over the course of the year to get a sense of what is the relationship between beliefs and behaviors in this context. Well, in general, the relationship between beliefs and behavior is complicated, and there's lots of work on this. And across the behavioral sciences, tons of articles have been written about this topic. The gist is beliefs matter. Sometimes for some kinds of behaviors in some situations, and there are many moderators of this relationship. And so it seemed worthwhile to look at that again in this longitudinal context, since there wasn't much longitudinal evidence at that time in this domain. Well, to investigate then this relationship between beliefs and behaviors, we measured a few different kinds of behaviors because there seemed like a few potential possibilities in terms of how this relationship could go. On one hand, it seems like, well, if people didn't believe in climate change, there might not be a need to take action. So beliefs might be a predictor of behavior in that way. And on the other hand, you might believe climate change is real, but again, doesn't require action now if you think the consequences aren't really going to affect you. A third possibility to us at the time seemed like, well, you might believe that climate change is real and someone should do something about it, but just not me, right? So these are some of the possibilities we thought of, and we just looked to see what was there. The question being, how much do people's beliefs map on to behaviors and other outcomes? So to measure this, we measured some individual level behaviors. We asked people how often they were doing things like recycling, using public transportation, buying eco-friendly products, etc. And we also looked at things like policy support. So how supportive were they of reducing emissions, regulating CO2, increasing fuel economy standards for cars, gas taxes, and the like. And again, we wanted to know how much the beliefs map onto these different kinds of outcomes. What we found was, for the question, does belief predict? The answer was yes and no. That is, across these different outcomes, we tend to find that beliefs were predictor policy support. Policy efforts to address climate change, but not so much individual level behaviors. So our respondents who believed climate change was real wanted the government to do something about it, but weren't necessarily behaving more sustainably themselves. And so that's where I started with environmental research. I learned about how individuals were thinking about environmental issues and the relationship between those thoughts and their behaviors and policy preferences. But I actually didn't really know what to do with that for a while. So it was clear that believers in climate change wanted policy changes, which made sense given the scope of the problem and what it really takes to address the problem. We really need some large-scale efforts, but wishing for policy changes doesn't make them magically happen. If you want policy changes, you need to understand how collectives or groups of people think and behave. Groups that might build coalitions to vote for initiatives, to lobby policymakers, to litigate and create legal and economic pressures for changes and the like. And so, given those realities, from research on social movements and the like, I started to wonder, who do people think are on their side when it comes to environmental issues? Who do they think actually shares their concerns? If you can accurately predict who's on your side, then you can build larger, more powerful coalitions to push for change. Whereas if you misperceive and mispredict others' concerns and perceptions, then you might miss opportunities for collective action. Well, at the time that I started thinking about that issue, some of my colleagues who are now frequent collaborators published a really fascinating paper about how Americans perceive environmental concerns of a variety of social groups. So on your screen, you'll see the groups that they studied across the x-axis. So they conducted this nationally representative survey of the American public, in which they asked Americans how much they think each of the following groups are concerned about the environment. And again, those groups are listed on the x-axis. What they found is that Americans tend to think that white people, young people, women are really concerned about the environment. So those are the highest levels of perceived concern. But that racial minorities and poorer people were not perceived as being particularly concerned about the environment. So Americans think if you want to find sort of like-minded people who are concerned about to look is really, younger, whiter, and more women in terms of demographics. So that's the perception. But the study didn't end there. They actually asked people in each of these groups how concerned they were about the environment. And what they found is that perceptions ran counter to reality. That is, the highest levels of environmental concern in the US are actually among racial minorities and poorer people in the United States. So there's this misperception about who is actually concerned about the environment in the US. And so that's a point where we had to take a step back and think about what this means more holistically. This is where that interdisciplinary perspective that Ezra asked me to talk about comes in handy. So, decades ago, Yuri Bronfenbrenner wrote about the importance of remembering that individuals are nested in broader social systems that affect how they make meaning of the world around them. Well, that framework turns out to be quite useful for pulling together findings from multiple disciplines to help us understand what's going on in the environmental realm. And that can help us move forward. So Ezra mentioned that I've been doing research not only in the environmental realm, but also in the education and health realm. In the education realm, I was doing a lot of work on how social stratification and segregation in the United States affect educational outcomes. Well, that turns out to be relevant here too. So demographers, historians, sociologists, people who study these kinds of patterns have shown us that even in modern times, our country is still highly segregated. This is a map of the city of Philadelphia that I pulled from the Cooper Center at the University of Virginia, which uses 2010 census data to plot where people live all across the United States. And when you look across the US, you see maps that look just like this. Neighborhoods are still highly segregated by race. There are white neighborhoods that are separate from Black neighborhoods and Hispanic neighborhoods and the like. And if we were to pull in the economists and their data into this conversation as well and layer wealth information on top of that, we'd see that, well, the whiter neighborhoods tend to be places that are wealthier than the racial minority neighborhoods. Well, all of that stuff matters for these environmental perceptions and intentions as well. When it comes time to place things like landfills and chemical plants or other environmental hazards, those kinds of things don't end up in the rich white neighborhoods. When there are proposals to develop these hazardous infrastructures, there are people that will say, not in my backyard, and they have the power to ensure that it does not, in fact, go in their backyards or in their neighborhoods. They make sure those hazards go on the other side of the tracks where those other people live. That stuff matters a lot. Going back to the figure I showed earlier, those other people notice that they're always the ones that are getting screwed over. And so they become very concerned, even though others don't think they're concerned, right? So these broader sociological forces matter for understanding the psychological phenomena that we're studying too. And so that's something we've been thinking about a lot in our current and future research. It's something we have to be mindful of. And we've been putting a lot of effort into recruiting members of communities that have historically been ignored in the research so that we can understand their perspectives on these issues, which matters greatly for things like collective action. So we've been putting a lot of effort into building community partnerships with organizations across the country to help us recruit participants from groups and places that are typically excluded and ignored in the research process. And in the before the pandemic, we were using this mobile research lab to bring the research to participants' own communities to study their experiences of environmental issues in the very places where they live, play, and work. So doing that has enabled us to get a richer understanding of them and their contexts. By doing this, we get to simultaneously study, the communication process. What are they hearing about environmental issues, the economic forces, what's going on in those places, the psychological processes on their mind. So in this lab, we've actually been able to do things like eye tracking studies, where we show people their own data and see what they pay attention to and what they take away from it. As well as the broader sociological processes. So we can get lots of information about what is happening in people's contexts and really capture the full ecological system in which people are embedded. As we've done this, right? So as we've diversified our samples, however, we've also learned that we have to think carefully about and deal with issues of measurement that become really critical to figure out as you study different groups of people. So earlier, I showed you the figure highlighting that racial minorities and Latinos in particular, you might have noticed was the biggest discrepancy, have the highest levels of environmental concern in the US. Well, we wanted to explore that a bit more. So one of the things we did was we conducted a study in San Antonio, Texas, which is majority Latino city. And we conducted both qualitative studies with Latino community group members, as well as larger survey research. But we started with the qualitative work to get a deeper and richer understanding of those experiences before we went on and did more survey research. So one of the things we did was we conducted focus groups in which we asked people things like, what are the most important environmental issues to you? And our participants named things like air pollution and green space, which are things that often come up in environmental research, particularly environmental psychology work. So we expected those kinds of responses, but they also brought up things like racism and poverty, and explained how and why they saw those issues as fundamental environmental issues as well. So these are not issues that typically come up when we study more affluent populations, but they came up in these studies, and we ended up learning that this is an important thing that we needed to think about more carefully. And we did some follow-up studies, larger survey research, to get a sense of how widespread these sort of issues are. We learned that these are often top of mind issues for communities of color and lower income communities. And so in some ways, this suggests that we might have to rethink some of our measurement strategies as we diversify our samples. So the other thing that stood out in that research process was how salient differences in life experiences were to our participants. When we asked them about the important environmental issues, they told us the issues that were important to them. But they also spontaneously noted the differences between their neighborhoods and other neighborhoods in their city. So this is an example of something one participant said. They told us the environmental issues they were concerned about, including racism and poverty and the like. And they noted, someone on the north side would probably say fracking. So in this particular city, the north side is where the rich white people live. It's another segregated city like many of the cities in the US. And so this participant was noting for us that these issues that are important for our community probably aren't going to come up in other communities, and that's something we should think about. So we followed up that qualitative work with larger scale survey research and found that this wasn't just unique to participants in San Antonio, that across the US, race, ethnicity, social class matter more generally for how Americans are conceptualizing environmental issues. So the key takeaway from these studies is that if we want to have more holistic understanding of environmental attitudes or other issues, we may actually have to measure different things as we diversify our samples, as we diversify our settings, and the like. But this matters a great deal for the inferences that we make, right? So if, for instance, we have to measure environmental concern differently among different subgroups of the population, what does that really mean for the construct and the generalizability of that construct? These are issues we have to wrestle with. If we have those kinds of issues, then we have to wrestle with how do we select appropriate statistical models to reach sound scientific judgments. We have to ask whether the models we're using actually map on to the judgments that we're trying to make. For more on these problems, I highly recommend this paper by Danielle Navarro, which does a phenomenal job of walking through some of these tensions. And these are some of the things we have to spend time figuring out because, frankly, they matter a great deal for people's lives. One of the things I've been thinking about is the issue of applying our research to problems in the world. And one of the papers that I've been thinking about a lot over the past few years is this paper by Cameron Brick and colleagues, which highlights what can happen if we get models wrong, and particularly if we omit perspectives that might be critical for how we should conduct our analyses, interpret our findings, and make policy recommendations, frankly. So in the environmental realm, we sometimes forget that our analyses suggesting taking particular action will reduce risk for one group might have unintended consequences for other groups. And we forget that when we don't study those other groups. One example of this that was highlighted in the Brick et al. Paper is a policy to get rid of diesel and gasoline cars by 2040 in the UK. And the goal of this policy is to reduce health and environmental risks associated with air pollution from these cars. And so the policy seems quite good for people in the UK and other parts of Europe that would not have these cars driving around in their streets. What we don't often talk about with this policy and policies like this, however, is that it drives up demand for things like lithium-ion batteries containing cobalt, most of which is mined in the Congo, and sometimes by children, right? So a law passed in one place in Europe will surely save European lives, but estimates by United Nations, Amnesty International suggest that it'll vastly increase the health and health risks and environmental damage to people in the Congo. So if we were just to sample, let's say, Europeans to get good measurements about their attitudes about such policy, then it might seem great and science might suggest it's a good idea. But if we broaden our sampling frame to include the Congolese and others, we might end up reaching different conclusions. And so this is what I mean by the importance of taking into account this broader set of issues and the interrelated processes. These kinds of things happen all the time, and not just on the international stage, but also domestically. You know, our policies often have disparate impacts. But as I showed earlier, if we're not really studying all the people who those policies affect, then we can run into problems. And that's something that weighs on me and that my collaborators and I have been thinking about a lot as we do our work. So we've been doing this research and doing research in this way at these multiple levels of analyses for two reasons. From a purely scientific perspective, we simply don't know how well our models hold up if we don't do this work, right? If we don't try to triangulate across samples, across contexts, trying to figure out when theories converge and when they diverge. So this has valuable scientific contributions in its own right. But a second, more ethical concern is something that weighs on us as well. And that is, if scientific knowledge will continue to lay the foundation for the policies we set in society, which is something that I think it should. We should use science to inform policy. Then that science, that knowledge, should include a broader base of people and consider the broader set of forces that will be affected by it. And that second point is something that's come up quite vividly as we've done our work. So as we've gone into communities to conduct our research, many of our participants have thanked us for coming and allowing them to participate in our studies. And the reason for that is that the opportunity to participate in studies is quite meaningful to participants, to community participants, because in their own words, no one usually cares what we think. This is something multiple participants said at the end as we were wrapping up studies. They're just thanking us for the opportunity to participate in these studies. And what that tells me is that it's as if they've learned from us, the scientific community, a lesson that was crystallized for me a few years ago in an op-ed workshop of all places. And that is, there are some people that narrate the world and other people who have their worlds narrated for them. That there are some people whose social conditions get to be part of the scientific record and others who don't, and they're always in that latter category. But exclusion from the research process has downstream consequences for what society does with that research. As R. and Squire noted, historical exclusivity often has a way of turning into present and institutionalized tragedy. Whose story gets told matters. Who gets to be part of our studies matters. Which forces we consider as we build these models, that matters for what conclusions we draw and what we do with those conclusions. So these are some of the reasons that I've been doing research at disciplinary intersections. The way I think about all of this now is that when we make decisions about who to include in our studies, how we can conduct our studies, which perspectives we're bringing in to think about these issues, we're implicitly making decisions about who matters to us and what aspects of their lives we're willing to consider. And we have to remember that because those decisions have important implications for the knowledge that we create and the policies and practices that are developed as a result of that knowledge. I want to quickly, in closing, thank the remarkable team of graduate students, collaborators, and community partners who've contributed to the work I present today and who have really shaped my thinking around these issues. And I will also want to thank our funders, the Atkinson Center for Sustainability, Cornell Office of Engaged Research, and the Cornell Center for Social Sciences. They've all generously funded this work in the past and continue to support these efforts. So I'll stop there and then take your questions. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Neil. So folks should feel free to put questions in the Q&A, and Neil and I will both keep an eye on those. But to get us started, I want to build off of where you kind of just ended things, Neil. One of the first things that you told us this morning is that you came out of a classic social psych program.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you can, and I think that's true of a lot of folks within the environmental psych domain, either social or cognitive development, but social psych certainly plays an outsized role in the environmental and conservation psych fields in terms of shaping at a very core level, kind of core assumptions, theories that inform the work that a lot of folks do. Not everybody, but a lot of folks. And I'm wondering how you, at what point in your career you kind of started to expand. I mean, I know it even started before you got to graduate school, but how you've brought in other perspectives and approaches, how you've tried to get beyond some of the known limitations of a social psychological approach, but not just methodologically, but particularly when it comes to thinking about real world problems like the ones that you're just talking about, whether they're environmental or otherwise, that clearly go beyond just what's going on in people's heads and interpersonally. So yeah. Just, I think, telling us a little bit more about that, your own evolution in your thinking and how you've incorporated other approaches, even though you do have social psych as your core training.
Yeah. So I came out of a traditional social psych program, but an important thing to know is all of my advisors are intervention scientists, right? So all trained in the social and, in one case, cognitive and mathematical psych traditions, but all do work that is about understanding problems in the world and coming up with interventions to address them. And so one of the things I learned from that is we always had to look beyond the discipline. Like, the social psych perspective of really thinking about the person and the situation at the same time, I think, that's still like the core way that I approach these questions. But what the situation means is much more than, the things we construct in the lab. Like if you think about people going through their everyday lives, we really have to think about things like their neighborhoods. So one of my advisors had a dual PhD in psych and social work. Like social work is really focused on things like what is in the neighborhood and what's available to you. And so that's something that from the very beginning was part of my training. Another one of my advisors was in communication, right? And thinking about the media ecosystem that people are exposed to. So, it was the way that I learned social psych was thinking about the core theories, but then also thinking about like a broader definition of situation than like, the lab. It's what's the media environment? It's what are the neighborhoods? It's what are the economics that are really driving these institutions in ways that affect what people can do. And so, that really helped me to just have a broader view of situation as I conducted my studies, and also forced me to really start reading more broadly in other fields, because that became essential for doing the kind of social psych that I wanted to do.
And I'm wondering if you can also tell folks a little bit. I mean, I noticed many of your papers have multiple collaborators, and I'm and I recognize some of the names, but not all of them. So I'm guessing that they come from multiple disciplines.
Yeah.
If you can talk a little bit about both challenges, but also some of the benefits that have come out of working in these interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary teams, and how that's worked, and your own role in particular, whether it's been as PI or in a collaborative role in those kinds of collaborations.
Yeah, so collaborative work is most of what I do. And I find it really valuable for all the reasons we're talking about. That the reality is that problems, when you have sort of a problem focused research approach, right? Like I think about, you know, education inequity, health inequity, environmental injustice. Those things don't like rest in any one discipline. So if you really want to tackle those problems, you have to work with people from multiple disciplines. So given that focus, that's why I do so much collaborative research. I really just need those perspectives to do a good job. The challenges associated with that, there are a few challenges. One, you know, it's a lot, there's a lot that you just don't know, right? Like I was trained in one discipline, I wasn't trained in all of these disciplines. And so you often feel like, I don't, you know, I often feel anyway, like, I don't know anything. There's so many things that I don't know that I need to know. And that can be scary at times, just to realize just how much there is still to learn. But that's one of the benefits of having the collaborators who can help you navigate, you know, another literature you haven't heard of that you should think about. And they're going to bring not only theoretical perspectives that can help you, but methodological perspectives that can help you too, right? I didn't really know how to think about, in my education work, I've often written about social stratification and affecting opportunity outcome, students' opportunities and the like, but I didn't really know methodologically how to study that until I started talking to more sociologists and demographers who this is their bread and butter, right? When I'm thinking about like policy changes in schools or like learning from the economists about how things get funded, that's really helpful for me to think about what is possible to do and what that means then psychologically for people. So yeah, that overall, I think there's a net benefit to doing all this collaborative work, but the big challenge is there's a lot more stuff you have to read. And, you know, within academia, different fields also value collaborations, different amounts. I'm fortunate to be in a communication department that values collaboration. All of us, if you look at our CVs, we all, most of us have these big collaborative teams, and that's just how we work. But yeah, those are some of the things you have to think about.
That's a great segue, because I was going to ask you about your department and kind of where you ended up.
Yeah.
I know we've got a lot of early career and graduate students in particular that listen into the webinar and been watching the videos.
Mm-hmm.
And I know with my own graduate students, I'm also not in a psychology department. I ended up in a Department of Environmental Conservation. And so we're always having a conversation about where folks might want to end up if they want to stay in academia. And I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about being in a comms department. You've got multiple appointments. And kind of similar question in terms of benefits and drawbacks. And also if you've got thoughts about training graduate students to be transdisciplinary researchers in your own mold, and how you recruit students who want to do that, and how you shape students in that direction, assuming that that's what you do.
Yeah, so the department I'll start with the first part about like selecting a department. So again, I was trained in a traditional social psych program, but I was always interested in intervention research. And the constant feedback I got from social psych, both within my own program as well as when I was in the job market, like I applied quite broadly. I applied to psych programs, I applied to public health, public policy, and like education, like Psych was less excited about the intervention and disparities part of my work than they were about my basic social cognition research. And I like my basic social cognition research. I still do some of that, but it's not the thing I was most passionate about. I was really passionate about the intervention side of things. And so COM was a place that was also really excited about that, right? So they, my department, during the interview and just talking to people, it's like I didn't feel like I had to apologize for being interested in intervention work and disparities work in the way that I felt like I always had to apologize for it at psychology departments that really wanted me to just focus on the basic social cognition and save the intervention disparity stuff for after tenure. And so that was important to me to be able to do the kind of work that I really wanted, and so that's why I came here. In terms of training students now, so I have students in comm, I have students in psychology, I have students in organizational behavior, I'm on committees in natural resources and the environment, and all of my students, I would say, are getting good interdisciplinary training just because the lab itself is very interdisciplinary. But the thing that I emphasize with all of them is I do think it is important to have your grounding in one discipline. Like interdisciplinary approaches are like important for all the reasons we just talked about, but you sort of have to decide like what perspective are you going to bring to these problems, right? So, I do this interdisciplinary work, but like when people read my work, it's very clear that I was trained as a social psychologist, right? And that's different than someone who would take the same perspective, same kind of perspectives, but who is trained as an organizational behavior scholar, right? There would be much more emphasis on features of organizations and the like than, my writing about these things are how do people make sense of all of those things rather than how is the organization like structuring things for people. So there's just like different ways that you would think about it, and you find which approach sort of is most of interest to you and sort of ground yourself in one. But you should still be aware of what's going on in other places that would help you. And so that's the way that I try to train my students is I'm pretty agnostic to which program students apply to when they're applying to work with me. I ask them like, what are you most interested in? So whichever approach you're like most interested in, that's the program you should apply to because you're going to get trained in a particular way. But then you'll be aware of the other programs in other disciplines too that matter for how you think about your topics.
That sounds like a very reasonable approach that is person-centered and allows them to kind of decide on the path that makes sense. While it sounds like, at least exposing and pushing them to consider how that perspective is one amongst many when it comes to solve, if you want to ask questions about real world problems and not very circumscribed lab types of questions or specific questions. I have one other more specific kind of researchy question about one of the studies that you were talking about, which was going back to these this misattribution work between who cares and who we think cares. Do you or others have a sense of where those misattributions come from? So you kind of pointed to some of the misattribution, particularly amongst minority groups, but I don't think I heard kind of an explanation of where misattribution or kind of overattribution of concern to whites comes from, and if that also is homogenous across the population. So does everybody overestimate and underestimate, or do we also see moderation as a function of race or other factors?
Yeah, so generally everyone overestimates that white people care more. There's moderation by how big the misattribution is, but the estimates move in that same direction. In terms of the source, our current thinking around that is really a saliency kind of explanation, right? So we've been looking a lot at media portrayals as well as makeup of environmental organizations and the like. and those are overwhelmingly white. So when you look at who is depicted as environmentalists and environmental people, it is white people. And when you look at the leadership of all the major environmental organizations, at least in the US context, it's white people. And so if that's who you see all the time as like the faces of the environmental movement, then it makes sense, and that's what you would think. That's the group you would think cares. And if you don't see anyone else, then it's just harder to imagine that those other people that you never see in these roles would care. So that's our current understanding of what's going on there. It sort of dovetails nicely into the media portrayals work, but also this broader role modeling work. So, part of the education side of my work focus a lot on the role of role models and motivating behavior. If you don't see people like you represented in spaces, it becomes harder to imagine that as a path for you. And I think some of those processes are relevant here too. If we don't see representation in this realm, it's just harder to imagine that.
And so this is such a great exemplar of trying to do work that moves beyond, right? Like you can integrate the survey work and some models, let's say from attribution and social cognition, but you also need to then take into account media exposure effects and media impacts from comms and other fields. And then ultimately, it sounds like the next step of the papers is to try and integrate those, whether it's trying to understand what media are people exposed to, or experimentally what happens when you change the imagery or the groups that are represented in this kind of work, which
exactly,
knowing you, guessing that that's part of where you or some of your colleagues are headed next.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we do and why it's, oh, I see Reiner's there.
Reiner says we did that already.
Yeah, Reiner said we did that already. Yeah, so Reiner's one of collaborators in this line of work. So yeah, it's important to really take into account all of these perspectives.
Great. Well, I'm gonna, unless any questions come in at the very last moment, I think we can wrap things up there. And I want to thank you again for joining us, Neil. It's really great to have you. And I hope we can get you even more involved in the division moving forward. And again, I want to thank everybody who's been coming to these webinars for the past 12 months and stuck with us despite this crazy year that we've all had. And I really do want to encourage people to keep tuning in as we continue the webinar series in 2021. So I hope everybody has a good end of their year, and we'll see you next year.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye all.